Nigel Farage, the man of the people, the most patriotic man in this country, someone who is fighting against the establishment to save all us ordinary folk. Except he isn't. Behind this carefully constructed image is a man who has a long history of manipulation and lying for his own political gain. In this video we'll break down exactly how Farage operates, how he twists data, frames narratives, and paints an image of himself as an anti-establishment figurehead who's fighting for the working class, while instead serving for the very same elite he claims to be fighting against. One of the main ways that Farage has succeeded politically and tricked the nation is through the creation of his anti-establishment and pro-working class image. This, however, is all an act. He cares as much about the working class as a landlord cares about the mould in his 73rd property. For example, Farage himself is deeply entrenched in elite circles. He was educated at Dulwich College, a highly prestigious private school in South London, and then he followed in his father's footsteps and went on to work as a city commodities trader before entering politics. And I know what you're thinking. Being born into privilege doesn't necessarily mean you continue to represent those circles. He may have had a wealthy and elite upbringing, but now he represents the working class, right? Nah, he doesn't. In fact, throughout his entire career he has been undermining the working class for his own political interests, and I'm about to give you 3 examples to prove it. For example, in late 2024, he and his Reform MPs voted against key worker protections such as banning 0-hour contracts and enforcing sick pay from the first day. Over 70% of voters, even in his own constituency, support these policies, but instead of helping us, Farage and Reform sided with their mates, and those are the top. Another example is literally this week, he is now claiming to be Robin Hood by taking from the rich to give to the poor. This is supposed to be done through charging non-doms, who are effectively very wealthy people who live in the UK, but their main home is abroad for tax reasons, £250,000, and then to give all that money directly to British people in the lowest tax brackets. This, however, is a complete trick, and almost exclusively benefits the very wealthy. This is because he's effectively allowing the non-doms who already live in the UK to pay a one-off payment of £250,000, making them exempt from pretty much all taxation on their assets and wealth. This is predicted to cost the UK over $35 billion in lost revenue over the next 5 years. So what public spending are you going to slash, Farage? NHS spending? Education? Childcare? Now that's less Robin Hood and more Liz Truss, let's be real. And considering that Farage said Liz Truss's budget was the best budget we had since Thatcher, you know, the one that crashed the economy, their similarity isn't too surprising. And one final example to highlight his direct efforts to work against the working class is despite publicly for years blaming the EU for undermining British industry and harming British workers, even claiming that if the UK voted to stay in the EU, that would be the end of British steel. However, in 2014, while Farage was a UKIP MEP for the European Parliament, he voted against a Labour Group amendment which would have resulted in higher anti-dumping measures for steel, essentially meaning countries who produce cheaper steel couldn't dump it on the market as easily, making UK steel producers lose sales. An amendment that would have massively helped the UK steel industry. So while Farage is portraying himself as a normal guy through clever marketing such as sitting in a pub garden with a cigarette, complaining about the elite Starmer government's proposal to ban smoking in pub gardens, or claiming to work in the steel industry when talking to steel workers, he was literally a commodity trader, remember, he's never had to work manual labour in his life. When in reality he is working against the British people in virtually every way that he can. And come on, we can't talk about Farage's manufactured image without bringing up the influence of the media. In fact, the media plays a massive role in promoting this anti-establishment narrative. And I'm not just talking about blatant propaganda, but the most damaging and something that goes largely unnoticed is how the media portrays them as a rebellious voice, and then they don't hold him accountable for things he said or done, allowing him to only comment on issues and then rarely face any public scrutiny. For example, Farage is of course the main man behind Brexit, and pretty much the reason we had the referendum in the first place. But despite after almost everyone agrees that Brexit was a disaster, 4% fall in GDP, the average British person being £2,000 worse off in real terms, foreign direct investment falling by 37% as businesses relocate into the EU, some great big successes from the main man himself. But despite this, no one seems to scrutinise him about it in the mainstream media. In fact, it's never even brought up. For example, Farage's whole message is to reduce immigration, but since Brexit immigration has skyrocketed, this would be such effective ammo to use to undermine Farage's talking points. I mean, should he really trust a man that pursued a political campaign that resulted in immigration skyrocketing to reduce immigration? Probably not. But because it's never mentioned in the mainstream media, it's never brought up in the pub. So effectively, during the Brexit campaign he was a rebellious voice defying the establishment. But as soon as his wishes came true and Brexit happened, he faces no repercussions for it, allowing him to maintain his anti-establishment, pro-working class image, despite being, a major reason of the UK's failing economy and as a result, the lives of ordinary people getting worse. Another major way Farage operates is through the manipulation of data. A common way this is done is Farage to discuss incredibly skewed bits of data whilst being outraged in order to also anger the public. And I'll give you 2 examples of him doing this. Take for example his repeated claim that 1 in 5 migrants are unemployed. Initially this sounds alarming. Most people would hear this figure and immediately think that 80% of the people coming into this country are living off taxpayer money and not contributing anything in return, understandably making most people concerned and others pretty angry. But when you actually look at the data, the reality is very different. This is because around 400,000 of that figure are students, who obviously aren't working, but are each bringing tens of thousands of pounds directly into the economy. 1, into payments to British universities, which range from £11,500 to £38,000 a year, and 2, as spending into the economy, through their ongoing living and travel costs, boosting local economies as a result. Most students also don't stay in the UK after their studies, as their degree is often worth more in their home country, meaning we don't have to be scared about them overcrowded in the UK. This figure also doesn't include partners of those coming in who are working, and literal children. Ironic as Farage also seems to push the idea that all migrants are men coming in on their own. But none of this is ever mentioned by Farage or the rest of the establishment, because it doesn't fit the narrative that all migrants are lazy and living off British handouts. He needs people to be angry and scared of migration, and twisting figures like this help him achieve that. Another great example of Farage manipulating data or straight up lying is during the Brexit campaign. Farage repeatedly claimed that 75 to 80% of British laws were made in Brussels, clearly sparking fears of the UK being controlled by a foreign power and dramatising the conversation around sovereignty within the UK, when in reality it was closer to around 10 to 20%, and most of these applied to stuff like trade policies, giving us better trade opportunities, and human rights, which I think we can all agree on should be protected. And with his 13.5 million features in question time, these made up and manipulated figures stick in people's heads. The third and arguably most important way Farage operates and manipulates the public is through using emotionally charged narratives to cause widespread concern and upset. And I'm going to give you 3 ways that he does this. First, he, with the media's help, has successfully framed the national conversation around immigration as being about illegal immigration. This is despite illegal immigration making up around 5% of total migration. And then when we see headlines screaming about hundreds of thousands of migrants coming into the country a year, it creates the image in people's heads that all migrants are invading our shores. This in turn makes people angry and upset, making immigration the most important topic in politics. And now that everyone thinks all of our issues are at the fault of immigration, who are they going to turn to solve it? Farage, of course. Another major way that he causes emotion is through pushing conversations around culture wars. For example, he will sit on GB News screaming about how wokeism is the death of British culture, or how he will ban flying non-British flags in the UK, effectively taking small issues and presenting them as big threats to British traditions or identity. By doing this, he creates drama and division, making people feel attacked, often turning irrelevant things into something to panic about. Because the pride flag flying in front of Tesco is the reason that everyone's poorer. This not only makes him seem like a common sense voice in the age of pointless culture wars, but it also distracts people from more serious issues, such as the decline of public services, rapidly growing wealth inequality, and an NHS on its knees, in turn keeping himself in the centre of the debate as someone who can put an end to all their woke nonsense. The third and final way that will be discussed of how Farage uses emotionally framed narratives to manipulate the public is through pursuing the idea that only reform voters are patriotic and everyone else hates our country. This is effective as most people in the country are patriotic, especially the working class, and rightfully so. And Farage utilises this to his advantage. In fact, he has effectively framed the rhetoric that if you love this country, you have to vote for reform, as they are the only true patriots in politics. You may love the NHS and want it to remain free at the point of service. You may love having better working conditions, and you may love having trade deals with our closest economic partners, which help British industry export as well as keep prices down. But none of these things matter in the world of Farage, as if you truly love this country, you must vote against all these things to protect British culture from wokeism and migrants. This is further effective as it often feels that the British left wing reject patriotism because of its connotations with nationalism, the right wing and reform, effectively creating a huge vacuum in politics that Farage can fill, waving a British flag whilst at the same time selling off our country to corporations and billionaires. So in conclusion, Farage understands something very important, that it's not all about facts. It never really was. It's about feelings. And as long as fear, division and manufactured outrage drives headlines, Farage will continue to rise in popularity. And if we don't want to live in a corporate hellhole that continues to extract money from the hands of the many into the pockets of the few, we need to fight back against these narratives. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is my first video, and if you enjoyed it, I would massively appreciate it if you could like and subscribe and comment any feedback that I can take on for my next video. Thank you.